Okay, we're here to talk today about what happens to couples regarding their sex lives after childbirth. Something that you, as health visiting midwives, are likely to come across when you visit couples who just had a baby. And I want to start by looking at something which may be familiar to a familiar scene to all of you, one you may not have exactly encountered, but it will ring true, I think, to most of you. And that is a couple who's at home in bed shortly after the baby is born. She can't wait to talk about the hard day she's had with the baby. So she says something like, "Oh, such a hard day. The baby slept about an hour total. But you know what? I think he smiled at me. I mean, I know people say it's just wind, but I think he smiled. And, you know, I couldn't wait for you to get home to talk about it." And he says to her, he breaks in and says, "You know what? You are so sexy in that nightdress. I've been thinking about you all day." And she goes, "What are you on about? Have you listened to a word I've said? Where is your mind? Is that all you ever think about, sex?" And they then have a complete rupture, and that's a kind of, as you would imagine, a kind of they go to sleep not talking. Okay, many of you will have seen or heard about such a scene. Well, why does that happen? Why is it a typical scene? The next bit that I'm going to talk about, is probably a review for many of you who've been on the Me, You, and Baby 2 activity. For some of you, this will be a new set of ideas, but not hard to get your mind around. So what happens after childbirth, typically, is that people are struggling with their new identities as parents, adding on to their identities as a couple. It's a complete change for them. They're also, for the women, struggling with physical pain. The men will have a hard time understanding that, partly because birth is a very singular experience. And that is also something that women often don't get, that they kind of, there's a mind-reading wish that their partner will really understand what it has been for them. And people who don't undergo childbirth really don't get that. So what happens is, particularly when we're talking about heterosexual couples here, there's a gendered difference from the outset, from around the experience of childbirth and around the experience of the physical aspects of after childbirth, so that the women who are breastfeeding, for instance, have a different sense of their breasts. Men also know that, but wonder something about what the breast is now. Is it a sexual, is it part of their sex lives, or is it something owned by the baby? By the way, women will have a similar kind of feeling about that. Women will be feeling, my body's changed, it wasn't mine, will it ever get back to what it was before? Men will also be wondering, will I get my wife back as I knew her before? And that kind of physical aspect of childbirth can come between them in that very gendered way as well. Men very much wonder, will we ever have sex again? And this is, I'm making sweeping statements here, because in general, I'm talking about a kind of very gendered, different experience for men and women. Obviously, there will be exceptions to this. But men will be worrying much more clearly about, will we ever have sex again? Women may put that same concern in a very different way, which is, will I ever feel sexual again? And will I ever be attractive and desirable again? And again, that's where the breast issue comes in. Are my breasts sexual organs, or are they actually about my baby? So those kinds of things are going on. They're questions that people will be struggling with. The thing about, well, as Me, You, and Baby 2, I think, underscored, is that this is a kind of a normal experience. This is what couples will be going through. And unless they have, as some women do, less likely men will, other people who they can share this experience with, and they know that this is a common response, they will feel very alone. And they will feel very bewildered, and they will feel very much troubled by this. And this is where, of course, you can come in. We'll come back to that in a moment. One of the things, so normalizing this experience of after childbirth and how sex becomes a different experience for them, a troubling arena for them, is something that could be very helpful to a couple. Also pointing out that it is a gendered experience, and that's a kind of thing you can't get over. We are our genders, whatever they may be. They inform our responses to experiences, and it is a gendered experience. If you have a same-sex lesbian couple, obviously the gendered experience becomes less of an important thing, marker, except it's important to say that childbirth is also a singular experience. So unless you've had it, you can't impose what it feels like onto the other person. There's a kind of divide around that. And couples who've particularly been close earlier, that's something that's hard for them to struggle with. This thing has come, a differential experience has come between them. The other thing that is important to remember is that the language of love in terms of gender is often, it is different. So that, and I'm going to again make sweeping statements here. In general, men will think about, will feel affirmed through a sexual communion, and women feel affirmed through affectional gestures and words, and they build up to the sexual communion through that. Whereas men, and they feel loved through that whole experience, and it isn't just sex that makes them feel loved. But with men, it goes the other way around. So the lack of sex becomes for men an expression of not being loved, not being thought of, not being affirmed. Whereas for women, it isn't quite that way. So the sex divide is characterized, which you will be often coming across after a couple has a child, has a baby, particularly in the first few months, is the absence of sex is often characterized by a disconnect from physical intimacy and a disconnect from verbal intimacy, and those two are tied in because the vicious cycle that people get into is that the lack of the physical can feel like a rejection for men, who then perhaps retreat or become angry, and the verbal intimacy is lost as well, and the affectional intimacy is lost as well. And if there isn't a shared understanding of what's going on for each other in this, that's a particularly dangerous, not dangerous, but that's a signal of the disconnect, which also is signaled in the change in the sexual relationship, which is now becoming disconnected too. So the disconnect is the problem, and the way back in is really something that I think you can be helpful to a couple to help them try to understand what's going on and to figure out ways back in. I just want to say something about that before we go into that, a little bit more about what the gendered divide can mean for people, and it might be helpful to help people understand this, is they end up, once there's the disconnect and the vicious cycle starts, they end up getting into a cycle of resentment or anger or disengagement, and it can be over what looks like literal things like you didn't help with the baby, it's the woman, or the man feeling that he was doing something that wasn't credited. And they often will have an argument or again, a disconnect over what looks like an argument over the housework or over the not being helpful. And in fact, what it is literally over is the emotional meaning of how they are disconnected from each other, whether they really do mean something to each other. There's one more thing I want to say about that, is that when a baby comes in, and I should have said this earlier, but when a baby comes into the relationship, there's a preoccupation that the mother and the father, to perhaps a lesser extent, but the mother because she's been preoccupied with the physical baby internal, who's been growing inside of her. The preoccupation, which has been called a maternal preoccupation, but I think we can think of it as a parental preoccupation. There's a focus on the baby now that means there's less of focus on the couple. That can lead to a feeling of, do I mean anything? Do I mean the same to my partner as I did before? The question arises of how much value we have for each other. So a lot of the arguments over, did you do enough? Did you do what I needed? Did you recognize what I did do? That happens when you're overwhelmed by new tasks and new things, functions of parenting, are really over how much do you focus on me? How much do you know that how much do you credit me for what I have done, for what I need? Are you paying attention to me? That's the emotional meaning. And when sex is not happening, the meaning of the focus on each other enters into that question of, what do I mean to you? So, here's the problem. Here's the issue for you. What can you, as workers with these people, when you encounter this, what can you offer to them? How can you help them? The first thing that you might do is ascertain with them, has this happened? I'm sure you're going to find out that it has, in most cases. Have they encountered these issues? Do they perceive it as a problem? Can they foresee it as a problem that could be happening in the future? So you can help them troubleshoot, even if they haven't recognized it. And that's where the normalizing comes in. Because if you normalize it, this is kind of what happens. Have you encountered this yet? This is kind of what you kind of expect to have happen. These kinds of issues will arise. This is what it tends to look like when couples have a baby. The focus goes off each other. They often find that sex goes out the window in the beginning. I don't know if that's happened to you. If it hasn't happened yet, it may happen in the future. And you kind of can probe by introducing that these are the kind of things that normally happen. You can introduce for them the idea that the danger of it is that you can begin to develop habits of not noticing each other, of not attending to physical intimacy, to your emotional intimacy, of not attending to each other, but only focusing on the new demands on you, on this new wonderful baby that's come between you, but also is shared by you. So you can begin to say that you can develop habits that diminish the importance of each other to each other, or you can develop habits that keep that going. And that's where you might introduce, you can introduce some tips. And the tips are things like questions around, so have you noticed whether you offer each other touching? Have you noticed whether cuddling happens? Have you noticed whether there are opportunities when you can reassure each other that even when there's been an argument, that you acknowledge that there has been an aftermath, that you have tried to do something, whether your partner has offered something, it may not have been the exact right thing, but has made an effort. Can you reassure? Can you reach out? Can you make sure that physical contact, not necessarily sexual contact, but be keeping the threads of physical intimacy alive so that they can begin to build, keeping the reassurance which says, I notice you've made an effort, I appreciate this, acknowledge that it's been hard, or on the other hand, acknowledge, I know it's been hard for you. Those sorts of reassuring become the threads that keep the couple relationship going. And that would be important to help them, to give them those kind of tips. The other thing that might be helpful to them is introducing them to the concept of there are skills in managing the conflicts when they arise. And those skills are things like keeping calm. And some of you might know the tips around taking deep breaths, making sure that you are sitting in a position of choice, and noticing when you're in a stressed position and putting yourself into a relaxation position so that you're able to become more able to be open to the other person and then thinking about the other person rather than being attentive to your own stressful responses. So you could be helpful in giving tips about how to calm down when conflict happens, because conflict will bring a stress reaction. Also, if you're in that stress state, you're not able to listen to your partner, and the partner may have something that would be useful to listen to or to think about later. And to be in a listening response is helpful to making conflict die down. Also, helping them figure out how to phrase things so that they can say things in terms of what they feel rather than attributing motives to their partners, which is always a dangerous thing. So making what we call I statements rather than you always, and assuming the kind of that you know what goes on in your partner's head when it may be wrong, and that will get their defenses up. So making I statements. Being able to offer things so that you can be in a position of offering rather than opposition, and thinking what is possible there. So offering some skills in conflict management when conflicts, as you already will have said, are normal to arise during this period, would be very helpful to them. And finally, maybe the final thing to think about is also to reassure them that, and this is partly normalizing, that actually sex does, for most people, come back into the picture, but that it will be built back in gradually, partly through the management of this period, through these tips, through these ways of using the skills of managing conflict, and also through using reassurance to each other, using acknowledgement and reassurance, using, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, using whatever humor they have used and they have bound together in the past to lighten moods, in jokes, returning to the things that they know have worked in the past for them, and using those skills again, perhaps when things have calmed down a bit more, because they connect them again. Keeping the connections open, physical, verbal, and through the use of their past humor and skills around those, and past around those, will keep the threads open so that eventually sex can return. And it will return as physical things begin to heal, as the overwhelmedness of being new parents, finding new roles, begins to calm slowly and gradually down, but won't if they don't develop the habits of reconnecting through these ways that we've discussed so far. That's where you can be helpful to keep them on that road and know and reassure them that there is a pathway back and they can reconnect. That's all really I want to say today, but if you have any questions, I'm very happy to take them down. Okay, I think I have a question coming from, my glasses on, from something's coming up now. Okay, can't quite see it. Okay, we had a question, okay, it's a question from someone saying, we had a question about what people can do when they feel like things are beyond their control, when we're in over our heads. Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, I hope you all do realize when you're in over your heads, because the best thing to know, the best thing you can offer is is from your own set of expertise, because that will give your clients faith in you, and they'll also have faith when you know that's the limit and know where to send them. And I think where you send them next is the kind of professional who is best able to find the right pathway for them. And I would say that's probably the GP, The GPs should be able to flag whether or not, to assess whether or not this is a real physical issue, for instance, whether this is a medical issue, whether this is something that needs a specialist intervention, like it's a complex thing and needs a therapist or a psychologist involved, or whether it's something that perhaps can be resolved through a session with a counselor or a set of online learning expertise that they can develop themselves. But I think that's where the GP should have that kind of specialist knowledge, and you will not. So flagging it to the next professional who can do that is probably the best thing you can do. Okay. Thank you.